Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of the DV Podcast. As always, I'm Matt Saintsing. You know, every service member stands ready to fight and win our nation's wars. But our guest today is someone who also documented it. My colleague, Elizabeth DePompei, sits down with Stacy Pearsall, an Air Force veteran whose combat images made their way to the Secretary of Defense and even the White House. Stacy was injured in Iraq, which ended her time in the Air Force. But her achievements since have been nothing short of inspiring. So let's not waste any more time. Here's Elizabeth and Stacy Pearsall.
I'm Stacy Pearsall, and I was in the United States Air Force. I served as a combat photographer, and now I do After Action and the Veterans Portrait Project.
So when and why did you decide to enlist in the Air Force?
Well, the military is a family business, and my dad was Navy. My sister had enlisted in the Air Force probably 6 months prior to me. And I was kind of dragging my feet, not really knowing where I was going, but I knew I wanted to do something in the arts. And my uncle was actually the guy who gave assignments to airmen who went to basic training without a set career field. So I called him up and I asked him what there was available, and he gave me a short list. And the next thing I know, I had a contract and I was on my way.
So how many years did you serve, and just in general, what was your military experience like?
I served 10 years, just over 10 years, actually. And my first 4 years were really spent in military intelligence, though I never anticipated going into that field. I had always thought I was just going to be a combat photographer, and that was it. And, well, not even a combat photographer, just a basic still photographer. When I went to the Defense Information School just after basic training, they had consolidated career fields and combined basic still photography with the U2 and gathering program, the U2 spycraft gathering program. Unfortunately, it was so funny. I ended up in the U2 program, and for 4 years was living inside a lab, inside a vault, inside of another vault, and couldn't talk about it. Anyway, I spent 4 years in that field and spent 4 years trying to get out of it. Luckily, I had found out about combat camera early on in my career, knew I wanted to try and do that, though it was a very elite field, and you had to be checking a lot of boxes to even be considered. While I was stationed in the United Kingdom, I found out that there was a position opening up at the one and only at the time combat camera in Charleston, South Carolina. And I did what every person would do, and I groveled for the job. Along with getting all those boxes checked. I honestly didn't think I had much of a chance, but in July of 2001, I got accepted, found out I got accepted, and that my report no later than date was going to be January 2002. So a lot transpired between the time I was accepted and to the time I reported. Needless to say, by the time I got to my unit, the majority of them were deployed to either Afghanistan or somewhere else in the global war on terror. And that really kind of set the tone for the rest of my career. I was on the road about 280 days a year, just running and gunning the whole time. And I loved every minute of it. Ultimately, a couple of injuries during combat was what ended my career and how I actually came to be a DAV member. I was injured in an IED, an improvised explosive device, roadside bomb in March of 2004. I recovered enough to get back to work, stayed on and kept deploying and kept going TDY up until my last combat deployment in Iraq in 2007. I was hit by another roadside bomb and followed by some injuries I sustained during an ambush. And after being medically evacuated home and spending 18 months in recovery, the military said that was no longer my path. So I joined the DAV, got transitioned as best I could at the time, and had a whole nother life after.
What was most rewarding about your time in the Air Force?
Well, it really depends on from what angle you're looking at it. I was 17 when I enlisted, so I learned a lot in those first few years, most especially if I were to look at personal growth, obviously having a lot of really great mentors along the way to lift me up, both men and women. And looking at it from a career standpoint, nothing matches trial by fire. You learn from everything. And I definitely have carried that with me. So looking back at my military career, there were a lot of bumps in the road, obviously, figuratively and literally. Some of them very, very painful, and some of those experiences I still carry with me today, but I have no regrets because I look back at that time and I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing now had I not lived through those experiences.
Do you mind sharing a little bit? Again, you talked about some of the challenges, but what was maybe the most challenging thing that you experienced in service?
And that's a complex question. Some of the things that I lived through. I grew up with a single mother, and she never really made me aware of my gender or what limitations I might confront in the road ahead. So when I joined the military and then when I went to combat camera specifically, or I was applying, I honestly didn't think I would have a lot of chance because mainly that was a career filled by men with lots of combat experience. And so I had none of that. And I was a lady. There were women there breaking barriers already. And so thankfully I was not treading on a well-worn path, but some of the harder paths have been broken in at that point, just newly, really. Getting there and realizing that some of the jobs that I wanted to do weren't allowed folks that looked like me. And I wasn't prepared for that. And so that was an interesting lesson, but also learning that I am always going to be my own advocate and showing, never demanding respect, but always earning it and working really, really hard to prove that I had what it takes. And I think that is something also that has stuck with me, in that you can cry about all the things that really suck, or you can come up with solutions to get over these hurdles. And sometimes it takes a lot, but to give up is to give up on yourself, and I wouldn't do that. Another lesson is from a journalism standpoint. I remember being in journalism school. The military had sent me to Syracuse University, and I remember sitting in an ethics class with kids that were like 10 years younger than me, all these undergrads, and they were talking about the ethics of journalism downrange. And I think uniquely, I had already been in service a long while at that point. Had a lot of journalism experience at that point as well. So I'm sitting in an ethics class with a lot of undergrads who are significantly younger than me, who have no experience, and they were sort of talking about this hard line of staying in the background and not interjecting yourself into the story. And it was funny because I found myself on more than one occasion becoming the story. And I did think that it was really difficult to not allow my own experiences to color what I was seeing. And that included being a woman in that specific space and time. And so I graduated Syracuse and I went back downrange, and I'm like, yeah, I appreciate the ethics class, but in this instance, I don't think it would do me any good to try and stay hardlined about it. So instead, I embraced my gender. I embraced the way I viewed the world around me and tried to tell people a story from the inside view. And that's, the military member is more than just the uniform they wear. It's more than just the sort of patriotic symbolism that it represents. They are human beings with backstories and things that they're carrying with them through these experiences that also change in color how they survive these unique circumstances. And I think that's what really separated my work and I don't want to say agenda, because that's not what it was. I was just trying to get through this experience and share with others what that experience was like. So I carried that sort of ideology with me. And after I lost the first friend on my last deployment who was killed in action, some of the fellow soldiers came to me and they were like, hey, do you have any pictures of them? We want to send them to their family. And yeah, I did. And for the other few that also were killed that day, I didn't. And it made me realize that my job was more than just telling stories. It was sometimes in a place to be the person to take the last living picture and to share what they were doing. And I carried that forward as well. And that, I think, is reflected through the work that I did with the Veterans Portrait Project. It was really sort of what inspired, in some respects, what inspired that. But also what I do through After Action as well is this attempt to try and lift the veil on the military experience in some way, and to allow some healing for people that don't really know or weren't in those moments with us.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk more about the Portrait Project and particularly After Action. But first, can you tell me a little bit about what your own transition was like out of the Air Force?
So my transition started technically in 2007 when I was in rehabilitation. They put me on a temporary retirement, and it was not a pleasant experience. Moreover, I would say like the Army particularly had a really great wounded warrior program for people who were in that sort of hiatus or that transition. The Air Force did not. And I would say also that the majority of the Air Force, not to say that they're working from the rear, but they're either seeing it from an air base or from 14,000 feet. To have somebody like myself who was on the ground with infantry was not the norm. And therefore, they weren't really prepared to deal with folks like me. So my transition was tough in that I had no one to lean on for the combat traumas specifically, or what my care was going to look like. Nobody handheld me through the VA, and that was a challenge in itself. Applying for disability, that was years in the making, and all of that was sort of, again, that trial by fire. Uniquely, being a woman, I faced a lot of uphill battles, mainly in that, going to the VA, it's predominantly male, given the percentage, a small percentage of women, but we are the fastest growing population in the veteran community. That said, the VA wasn't necessarily accustomed to servicing veterans that look like me or my demographic. I think a lot of it was like going to my neurologist, for instance, and having to explain how a young woman like myself was exposed to explosives or how I got a traumatic brain injury. And I was like, do you guys question the men like this? Do they get grilled? Do they get the third degree? And then not just that from the inside perspective, but also from within my veteran community. There was always this assumption that I was bringing my husband or my dad to their doctor's appointment, not that I was a veteran. And then like, hey, what's your sponsor social security number? I'm like, I am the veteran. Can we just get past this, you guys? And I got really fatigued in having to constantly educate people, and it turned me very bitter. I was already struggling with the loss of my career as that was sort of unraveling and devolving. I was still struggling with post-traumatic stress, and I was in a place of like, I had suicidal ideation at that time. I was trying to work out a plan and feeling completely alienated from my veteran community, completely looked over in so many ways. And it just put me in a really bad spot. So that was a tremendously challenging part of my life. I try to equate it to being like in the middle of like the worst divorce ever in a unrequited relationship where you're trying to hold on really, really tight, but there's really nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, what you described is too common of an experience among women veterans in particular. And it's one thing to hear that story once or twice, but it's a story I hear over and over and over again. So thank you for sharing that. And so remind me, at what point did you kind of find DAV, and how did DAV help you in that transition?
As I was transitioning, and I was literally in the dark hallway without a flashlight, and I was searching for somebody to help illuminate the process or the path for me because I had no idea what I was doing or where I was going. And I was really struggling mentally, as for the reasons I mentioned before. And I began to research veteran service organizations that could help me through that process. And being a disabled American veteran, it seemed right that I would approach the DAV, and that I became a life member. I looked it up this morning. I've been a life member since 2010 with the DAV. At the time, they were helping me through the process of the VA, kind of trying to translate that for me. Veteran service officers were helping me try to navigate that process better, understand what was offered to me and what I had rights to, in addition to other DAV-sponsored programs at the time.
So the Veterans Portrait Project, which you've already talked about a little bit, how many years has that been a project? Is this something that you still, that's ongoing?
When I was in the recovery process, the doctors were really fixated on all the things that I couldn't do instead of telling me the things that I still had to offer. I had to find that out on my own. I started taking portraits and telling veteran stories because I was in the VA surrounded by veterans whose stories I didn't know. And then I was in that really dark headspace. I found myself like I could either become consumed by all the things that I couldn't do anymore or really try to suss out the things that I had left to give. And photography, I felt like was one of them. I met a World War II veteran while at the VA, and he was a volunteer there and just an amazing guy who recognized that I was kind of struggling. And he was the first portrait I ever took. His name is Mickey Dorsey. And from there, I was like, okay, well, I had the camera back in my hands, despite the doctors saying I wouldn't be able to lift anything over 5 pounds. I got through a couple of hours of shooting, despite them saying I wouldn't be able to stand for prolonged periods. So checking these boxes in my head, it gave me the mental strength to forge ahead. And then, with every veteran, it kind of validated where I was in my experiences, that I wasn't alone. And whether it was a man or a woman, I always got something cathartic out of it, not just giving back to them and giving them their moment to shine and to tell their stories, but to also like give me a sense of place. Initially, I started in Charleston. That first year, I think I photographed something like 300 veterans. And then I was like, okay, well, let me see if I can get out to other states. So I went to Georgia next, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and then I started like branching out a little further. I went to Florida. And finally, I stepped back after like year 2. I said, what am I doing here? What's the goal? What's the purpose? Everybody needs a mission, right? And so my new mission was to photograph veterans in every state. And I was like, this is going to take me a lifetime just to raise the money and to get out to these places logistically. With the more that I did, the more support that came on board. People in other states wanted to sponsor me to come to their state. And so next thing I know, I'm putting everything else aside and just doing the Veterans Portrait Project. So for 10 years, I traveled 189 events I did in all 50 states. And ironically, the last state that I did was Nebraska in 2019. And just so happens that Omaha, Nebraska, where I did my culminating event, is where my first duty assignment was in the Air Force. So ultimately, it took me 11 years to get the Mission Complete tour done, the 50 states. But I still do the VPP, and I do that in conjunction with After Action, actually.
And what kind of impact have you seen the Portrait Project have on the veterans or the veterans' families?
I initially didn't think that the Veterans Portrait Project would be anything other than sort of self-serving for me, and that I would get to take a picture, I would give it to them, and here's my gift, whether they appreciate it or not. Okay, we'll see what happens. But every veteran has been so thoughtful and happy with their portraits. What I had not anticipated was the healing that I would receive during these portrait sessions, but even more so what they were getting as well. One particular story sticks out to me. I was at a VFW convention with my studio, and this Marine Corps veteran, Vietnam era, walked up, his wife. I put her in a seat kind of over our shoulder this way, and then he and I started talking. And I was like, so what did you do in the Army? I think maybe it was Army or Marines. I have like 8,500 veteran stories, but I can see his face. What did you do? And he said, well, you can relate as a combat photographer. I was the guy who had to identify remains and to take archive of their effects. And he and I were just so engrossed. We were literally in a convention building, but in that moment, it was just him and I talking about the real stuff, the emotions that kind of went with it, what we're still carrying, and talked about having night terrors. And so we just really related on that sort of common shared trauma, so to speak. And then what really broke my attention was this sort of like sobbing over my shoulder that was happening. And it turns out his wife was sitting in the chair just crying. Afterwards, she hugged me and she was like, every night he wages war in his sleep. And I have no idea. I have never heard these stories before. I had no idea what he had been through. So that was sort of that epiphany for me that we as veterans, we guard our stories so closely and we don't share them with people outside of our intimate circle, our veteran community, because we don't want to re-injure or we don't want to project our pain and our injuries onto those we love. If it hurts us and we're battling these nightmares every night, why would we want to give that to our families? But in the process, it has created this gulf, right? This distance, both sort of metaphorically and emotionally. And that really led me to want to do something about it. And that's how I came to approach South Carolina ETB about After Action.
Perfect segue. So for those who haven't heard of it, what is After Action and how did that come about?
After Action is a show that features veterans. I sit down in my house with 3 veterans and we talk about a certain topic, one that's really important to that specific group. In season 1, I sat down with 3 veterans and we talked about what it was like to be the lone survivor from a combat operation. I talked to 3 women veterans who were the first in their fields to do XYZ. One was a helicopter pilot, another one was an A-10 crew chief. And we also talked about what it was like to be conditioned to be a military member, but never had the ability to be unhardwired, so to speak, when we were beginning to that transition and how jarring that was or still is for so many, no matter how many years have separated them. But anyway, After Action is a show that's meant to sort of demystify that military experience, to let people be a fly on the wall when veterans are talking those truths to each other without any filter. And for all the sort of lingo that we talk and the nomenclatures and the abbreviations, the acronyms, whatever, the show actually translates that for the viewer. And we try really, really hard to, provide those sort of subtitles and subcontexts as the show unfolds. We had a really, really great response from season 1. So when we went into season 2, we wanted to dive even further into sort of the more interpersonal experiences and how some subgroups of the military or demographics change, maybe influence or impact them as a veteran in their lives after service.
So what is some of the feedback that you've heard from particularly the general public and civilian population?
I think it's been unanimously well received in that, again, being able to translate what exactly military members are talking about first and foremost is we have a tendency to talk amongst ourselves and to talk well over people's heads, because if you haven't been there, then you're probably not going to get it. But the shows helped translate that for folks in such a way that made sense and also illuminated what that military experience is like that makes us tick, like what makes us us, even just those 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks, or if you're the Marine for 5 months, however long you spend in basic training, becoming military, what transition or what that is like.
Have you found personally or any other veterans that you've worked with that helping kind of close that military civilian divide and increase that understanding, is that rewarding or healing for you as a veteran?
From jump, when I was talking to the director of the show, Don Godish, about how we were developing After Action and what we really wanted to accomplish, one of the things we wanted to do was to help reconnect families and friends and loved ones with their veteran. For me personally, I've lost some friends to suicide. It's an epidemic in our community. And I felt like by opening the dialogue or trying to spark conversations between our communities, this would help at least bridge a gap for that communication to start. And I think if we walked away with one viewer interceding on their veteran's behalf or one veteran watching the show change their mind about, completing their life, then the show has been worth it. And I think we've achieved that. And then some. And I hope that season 2 will continue to broaden that healing process, to continue to expand people's knowledge about who the veteran community is, and that it includes so much more than what Hollywood and what the sort of mainstream media feeds to people.
So season 2 comes out in May, correct?
Yes.
And it will include an episode focused on women veterans. You alluded to that earlier.
The episode is Invisible Veterans. It's actually going to be episode number 3. So don't miss out on the first 2, but definitely watch episode 3. What really drills down to the heart of the woman veteran experience. Granted, I was already out of the service when combat roles were officially open to women. But I was a combat veteran. I had worked with the infantry, earned combat medals, but somehow always feeling less than, made to feel that way for one reason or another, whether in some regards that was self-imposed or for the majority externally imposed upon me. So we talk about this commonality where you could go to your local grocery store with a veteran's parking space designated for the veteran that wants to go shopping. The minute one of us pulls into a parking space, we are confronted every time by somebody who assumes we are not the veteran, all the way down to how different our healthcare is from the veteran healthcare system for females than it is for our male counterparts. I know for me, it was really, really important to speak to women veterans who were listening that have not pursued the benefits they earned during service for those reasons that I've already said, and to make sure that they know they are entitled to the same benefits. And if we do not rally and claim our space, then it will continue to be an uphill battle until we become our advocates for ourselves and for the women around us. It'll continue to be a struggle. And so to not give up, to own the space that we've held here, that women before us have worked hard to pave that path for us, and to continue to pass that baton forward no matter how difficult it seems.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And thank you for mentioning that. We need veterans, we need women veterans to utilize those services and push for better so that they can get better. And so, the generations that come up behind them can also, hopefully not have the same struggle. So as you know, DAV recently released a report on women veterans and mental health and suicide. When you saw that report, is there anything that jumped out to you in particular, or did you kind of see your own experiences reflected there?
I have to say, sadly, nothing in that report surprised me. I think having lived most of those experiences, it did not come as a shock. What I do hope is that people who read that are surprised, take the time to really explore other veterans, sort of anecdotally, what their experiences are, and to help modify and continue to develop and enhance programs for women. Whether that's for homelessness, because women veterans, particularly who are struggling with homelessness, do not have the same opportunities afforded them as their male counterparts, whether that's because they have children with them or, whatever. Read the report. That's all I gotta say.
Yeah.
Because there are extenuating circumstances unique to women. And I think this report definitely helps reveal a lot of that.
Yeah, I think something that stuck out to me and not being a veteran myself is, you were kind of maybe alluding to this, is rarely is it a veteran who experienced this one bad thing and they're just dealing with that. That one bad thing happens. So maybe they experience MST and then they find themselves in abusive relationships and then they find themselves homeless. It's just a very complicated picture most of the time.
We did in season 1, we did an episode about military sexual trauma. And one of our veterans, Connie Osher, was so incredibly transparent and just really open about her experience. But she experienced MST, was discharged from the Army, did not get mental health care at the time, and it just built. And so she began to self-medicate, and a lot of veterans do that. Self-medication led to a myriad of other complications, and eventually she was homeless. So yes, I think, as you said, it can be the sort of domino effect. It would be a lofty ambition to say that we would catch everybody before it devolved that far, but we can make better steps to catch veterans earlier on to maybe help prevent or help them navigate some of those tougher experiences as they carry these traumas with them.
Stacy, first, if you can tell people where they can find After Action and learn more, and then if there's anything else that you would like to add.
Well, so After Action will be available for streaming on PBS come May. So if you are on the webs, you can look up pbs.org/show/after-action, and you'll find the episodes as they release weekly. Or you can check your local PBS station for air dates and times. It'll vary across the U.S. Also, please feel free to visit the website afteractionshow.org.
Yeah, and then there are lots of great resources there as well. I personally watch on Amazon Prime Video, so you can find it there as well. Stacy, thank you so much for your service and for everything that you continue to do.
I appreciate you taking the time and allowing me to talk, and to all my fellow DAVers out there. I hope you're all well, and thank you so much for the support. Please tune into After Action this spring.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And thank you, Stacy, for sharing your incredible story. You can learn more about the Veterans Portrait Project at veteransportraitproject.com. Thanks again for listening. I'm Matt Saintsing. Until next time.